Hi, here are my 10 top tips for refining your comparative study. The reason I'm an examiner for this comparative study is that I love learning. I'm a massive nerd and I find such joy in finding out about new artists, new ways of working, diving in and understanding how an artist did it, why did they use that material, what is it for, how does this reflect the culture, how is this evocative in the time and space it was made, how do I see it differently now, how would I have seen it then, learning about the wider context of work. I think it makes me a better teacher, it makes me a better learner, and it makes me a better artist. The more I can understand a visual vocabulary as well as a personal vocabulary and a holistic vocabulary and a societal vocabulary, the better I can use them. The more I know about the world I'm in, the better I can make use of these signs and symbols and ideas within my own artwork. So I really enjoy the opportunity just to kind of dive in. First thing I just want to remind everyone is that everybody has to produce 10 to 15 screens. Now it says screens because you've got to remember that your slides are static. So you cannot have any animations or videos or embedded links that the examiner needs to check. They will see the slides as screens, and that's why it says screens. Your 10 to 15 screens are for criteria A to E. If you produce under 10 screens or over 15 screens, it will affect your grade. You also need to include a list of sources for both standard and higher level. This needs to be references that include information that you have used, and you also need to have the list of sources recognised at the point of use. Your list of sources will be uploaded as a separate document than your comparative study. For higher level, your comparative study will also include, after your 10 to 15 slides, will also include an additional 3 to 5 slides that explore how your work connects to the work of the artist. So just a reminder, when we're looking at a piece of work, it's the composition and the technique working together. These are our formal qualities. It's informed by the concept. This is what we describe as on the canvas. It's what the artist has presented us. It's informed by the artist world and their life, which is informed by the art world, what movements were happening, etc., which is influenced by the wider world. So the wider world, the art world, and the artist world are what we consider to be our cultural context. They all inform the concept behind the piece that is being produced and answers the question, what does the artist want me to understand? This is our function and purpose. Your job is to try and connect these together to see what we can see in the piece. How did the world inform the art? Why did they make it? What do they want me to understand? And what can I see? So the wider world informs the art world informs the artist world, which informs what we see on the canvas and informs the composition and the technique. Your first piece of advice is to make sure that they're all from different cultural contexts. So see how these three works connect and compare together. Remember, they could connect in really interesting and exciting ways. They could have surprising coincidences, but also there could be some really obvious ones, so you don't necessarily need to make it too hard for yourself. But ensure it's from different cultural context. Don't take artists within the same time period, within the same space, within the same environment, and try and compare them, especially if it's within a movement. You could think about very different experiences, but you'd have to do the work to prove that. For example, an artist living in South Africa, in the middle of a city, is going to have a very different experience from a Maasai tribe member. If you signify what those cultural contexts are and explain them, that would make sense. You could also look at Germany across 2 centuries. But you can't have 2 people from the same space at the same time if you're only looking at 2 artists. Make sure that your artists are coming from different cultural contexts. The second thing I want to say is tell me a story. So I want you to take me through to show me how the pieces fit together. Consider each one of the elements, your function and purpose, your formal qualities, and your cultural context, to be a piece of the puzzle, and you're telling me how they fit together. Remember, an analysis is breaking something down into its component parts and seeing how they fit together. So as you're doing your analysis, I want you to tell me the story of how they fit back together. The best candidates use a comparison screens to develop a discussion. Often candidates gave an overview of the comparison in their introduction and developed this throughout the study. Comparisons were most effective when the artwork selected made for meaningful contrast, for example, a similar subject from different times and cultures. It might be that you don't have enough in your story to tell me why these are dramatically different. Find something that shows me what I'm looking at next. Tell me the story and decide what order to put them in. Even though formal qualities is A, function and purpose is B, and cultural context is C, I think it makes more sense to look at the cultural context before the function and purpose, because one is informed by the other. But you need to tell me your story. Which order do you want to put them in? The third thing I would say is introduce it. The fundamental thing I need to understand from this is you're going to love reading this. Get me excited. I've had a hard day at work. I've come home and I now have to grade these. I don't need to know about the assessment criteria because they've already been set. So tell me what has attracted you to these artists, you to study this thing, you to make these connections. Don't worry about repeating the assessment criteria or being vague. Be specific about your learning and your investigation. What interests you? What have you discovered? I would also say this could be the last thing that you do, because it's going to actually introduce the study that we're going to see afterwards. So I would end as my last thing with making sure my introduction is a coherent introduction to what I'm actually going to read. That's the first piece of the puzzle. My fourth piece of advice is reference, reference, reference. Too many candidates do not acknowledge that they are including works copied verbatim and are not using quotation marks when required. Remember, if you don't show that it's informed by research, you're not going to get out of that first bracket. So cite all sources, supporting images such as contextualizing photographs and pre-designed PowerPoint templates. It's fine if you have used somebody else's work, but it's somebody else's work. They deserve the credit for it. It's fine if you've done the research. That's what we want to see. You deserve the credit for doing the research. Remember that failure to acknowledge a source will be treated as potential academic misconduct. So you're being rewarded for showing your sources and being penalised for not showing sources. Always show sources, always reference them, always celebrate the research you've done. Remember that citing a fact or paraphrasing content from a source is not an analysis, and this limited approach is the reason why many candidates did not achieve above a mid-mark level. So although we have references for information, that doesn't tell me that you know what that information says. Many candidates are using an effective academic referencing for both their list of sources and at the point of use. However, many candidates fail to include all references and cite sources at the point of use as required. Remember, if on this page I have information, I need to cite it on that information, cite the source of the information at site. So here I've got an example in the middle where we've got a number 3 and then the reference for it. Just a reminder, you could include the number 3 and then on a footnote on your page include the reference. But remember, the examiner cannot see anything other than a PDF. So all of your embedded links will not work. So it has to be a clean and cohesive quotation and referencing system where it can be seen but it cannot be clicked on and it cannot take over. If you want any more help on this, remember that on our site there's research and academic honesty page. So advice number 5 is use evidence to be consistently informed. Ask yourself, when you use a quote, so what? The artist said this, so what? Make sure that you are supporting your interpretation with evidence and evaluation of artwork. That's features of good responses. Evidence comes from accurate observation of the selected artworks and from relevant contextual research. The better candidates evaluate sources and make an appropriate selection of knowledge to support their interpretations. Don't just give me information, use it. Don't just make a point or provide me with evidence. Put all of it together to prove your point. On the website, we've got this post-it answers as a suggestion of how to do that. Remember, only the best candidates were able to use their research to convincingly contextualize the artworks and develop a deeper understanding as to meaning and significance. And remember, citing a fact or paraphrasing content from a source is not analysis, and that's the reason why many did not achieve beyond that mid-level. So, avoid using excessive paraphrasing and quotations, and start using a few well-placed ones to prove a point. So don't just include quotations and paraphrasing, use them to prove a point. Suggestion number 6 is think about, why does this matter to the piece? So when we're talking about our analysis, we need to make sure that we pull it down to the piece. Our analysis, our jigsaw being put together, means that we need to fit these pieces together to explain the artwork that we're contextualizing. So you're comparing the artwork, not the artists. You're comparing what is happening on the canvas, informed by the world that they live in, informed by their life, informed by the times, informed by the world that the artist is coming from. But it's the artwork, not the artist, that's being compared. Number 7, use subject-specific vocabulary. By not using the subject-specific language, we end up using more words than we need to and sounding less good. So, for example, we could be more concise and coherent by using appropriate vocabulary. A lot of the comparative studies that I read will undermine the student just because they haven't been able to pick out the specific vocabulary to use. It undermines some of the points that they're making. So the more coherent and concise your writing can be, the better. Focus on your words, focus on the words that you're using, and make sure you're thinking about what is the artistic term for what I'm talking about. Using evidence. So in this respect, successful candidates linked their contextual research to specific artworks. This included a consideration of the cultural, socio-political, and historical significance of the piece, their original audience and purpose, as well as how they might be read by a contemporary audience. Remember, we're putting our pieces of the puzzle together. If we think about timelines, remember that there are so many things happening at that time that's beyond the artwork. But we've got to think about which ones of these are actually important to this piece of art. For example, if I looked at a piece in 1918, it is in the middle of World War I, and Alfonso XIII is the monarch. There's Dadaism, there's Cubism, and there's a course in general linguistics. Not all of those things will be relevant to the piece that I'm talking about, So I need to pick out which pieces are specific to the artwork that I am looking at. And I need to prove that this is evidence, this cultural phenomenon informs something in this piece. I don't need a full timeline of everything that was happening. I just need to know what is important to this piece. You could think about it in terms of what was happening in the artist world, what was happening in the art world, and what was happening in the wider world, and then pick out which ones are important. For example, in the wider world, there might have been the World War. In the art world, there might have been Dadaism, but in the artist world, they might have been going through a divorce. The painting could be just about the divorce and wouldn't necessarily reference what was happening in the art world or the wider world. So although we investigate all three areas, we have to point out which parts of all or any are relevant to this piece. Remember, this piece of work, not the artist in general, and not other artists at the time, unless you're comparing it to this piece of work. This brings me on to comparisons and connections. So remember, the whole thing is a comparison. Making comparisons and connection screens in order to develop a discussion is fine. You can give an overview of the comparison in your introduction and develop this throughout the study. Comparisons were most effective when the artwork selected made for meaningful contrast. So think about what it is that makes them unified and what it is that makes them different. What it is that makes each one of them on a superficial level as well as with depth. What first attracted you? What do you know now? The examiner doesn't want to read the exact same points that the whole comparative study told them. Bring them together and make logical and coherent conclusions. Avoid just comparing and connecting with bullet lists, since it hinders that critical analysis. It doesn't really give you the opportunity to have as much depth. And you should be able to conduct analysis of the selected artworks and go beyond a description. For that reason also, Venn diagrams can be limiting. Remember, if we have a Venn diagram, it might be also in the form of a bullet, so it could be limiting as well. The last piece of advice is make sure it's legible. Ironically, you see how I've changed my design scheme here. It looks like I've just copied and pasted it from somewhere. It looks like it's been an afterthought. It looks like it doesn't make sense within this presentation. So use a consistent design scheme for your presentation. Use one or two fonts throughout the presentation. Maybe think about having one for your subtitles and titles and one for your body text. But keep it coherent. I would recommend having sans serif fonts because they're easier to read on a screen. Your examiner's done a full day at work. They've been on screens. We've all been on screens, especially these last few years, more than ever before. So after a full day of work, they're coming home and then going on to mark yours as well. You want to make it as easy for them as possible, as pain-free for them as possible. So avoid narrow and cursive fonts. They might look great, but they're harder to read. So make backgrounds subtle and consistent and use high contrast between the background and the text colour. With that in mind, I would avoid having a black background and white or red text. Avoid it. No one likes it. It stresses. It's hard to see. It stresses the examiner out. Last bit of advice. Keep your slides landscape, not portrait. Keep your font consistent, maximum of 2. Font size 12. Don't go too small. But you can have your referencing be a 6 or an 8. Your referencing can be smaller underneath the image where it's been used. So if you're referencing an image, that can all be a smaller font size. Also, when you're putting references on a page, that can also be a smaller font size, as we can understand the differences between the two. If you have any questions or anything else I can help you with, please reach out and let me know. All the best.